Biologist takes a risk and releases a wolf pup trapped in a snare. Later, the pack shows up, and what they do to him is terrifying. Lucas was at his breaking point, the kind where you can no longer pretend everything is fine. He, who had always believed in people, was betrayed by someone he called a friend. This person, whom Lucas had trusted and worked with for years, stole all his ideas and took the credit for a project Lucas had dedicated years of his life to. It felt like being stabbed in the back, worse, by someone he thought would protect him. It broke Lucas. Right then and there, he decided, enough of trusting people. Never again. Feeling like the world no longer made sense, Lucas isolated himself. He packed a backpack, some field equipment, and turned to the one thing that had never let him down: nature. The forest had been his refuge since childhood, the only place where he felt he could truly breathe. But this time, even the sound of leaves rustling in the wind seemed unable to lighten the heavy burden he carried. As he wandered alone, kicking stones and lost in thoughts of anger and sadness, Lucas heard a sound. It wasn't anything he had expected. Not the call of a bird or the rustling of an animal passing by. It was a whimper, soft, almost muffled. Something was in pain. He stopped for a moment, held his breath, and tried to locate the sound. Carefully, he followed the noise until he stumbled upon the scene. Right there, in the middle of some leaves and branches, was a wolf pup. It was small, skinny, its fur matted with mud, and caught in a trap. The metal snare had clamped down on one of its legs. The pup was desperately trying to pull its leg free, but it couldn't escape. Its eyes were filled with fear, as if it knew its end was near. Lucas felt a tightness in his chest. He knew it wasn't the pup's fault for being trapped, but rather the fault of some cruel human who thought this was a good idea. Suddenly, he wasn't thinking about the friend who had betrayed him or the weight of his own problems. All he could focus on was this pup, so helpless, fighting to survive. It was as if the animal's suffering was tugging at a part of Lucas he thought he'd lost, his ability to feel empathy. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. A part of him, the bitter, wounded part, wanted to turn away and keep walking. It's not my problem, he thought. But another part, the one he hadn't listened to in a long time, told him he needed to do something. He knew that if he left the pup there, it would probably die. And Lucas wasn't ready to carry that guilt. He took a deep breath, crouched down, and tried to approach slowly. The pup let out a low growl, pulling back as much as it could, despite being trapped. Lucas saw that it was terrified but also realized it didn't have the strength to resist much. "Easy, little one. I just want to help," he said, not expecting the wolf to understand. Even so, he kept talking in the calmest voice he could find. Lucas knew that at that moment, the words didn't matter as much as the tone. He pulled a knife from his backpack and began working to free the pup. Every movement had to be careful. The trap was tight, and the pup was trembling so much that Lucas feared hurting it even more. When he finally managed to pry the metal open, he saw the wound on the animal's leg. It was bad, covered in dried blood and dirt, but the pup was still alive. It was a miracle. Lucas wrapped the little wolf in a blanket he had in his backpack. He didn't know if the animal would survive, but he couldn't leave it there. As he carried the pup back to his campsite, he felt something different. It wasn't happiness or relief, but a spark. A strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was still goodness within him, even after everything he had been through. That night, as he treated the pup's wound, Lucas realized something inside him was changing. He didn't know what it was yet, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had done the right thing. And that, just that, was a start. Lucas barely slept that night. He tossed and turned in his sleeping bag while the sound of the pup's whimpers replayed in his mind. The little wolf lay there, wrapped in the blanket near the fire, breathing softly. But the silence didn't bring peace. Lucas had done something by freeing it from the trap, right? So why did it feel like it wasn't enough? The question kept hammering in his head. What now? He could leave the pup in the forest the next morning and go on his way. Isn't that what wild animals needed? Freedom? But every time he thought of that, the image of the trapped pup, crying out in pain, came back with force. He knew the little one didn't stand a chance of surviving alone. With that injured leg, how would it hunt, defend itself, or return to its pack. Lucas sighed, exhausted, as he watched the pup sleep. It was so small, so fragile, that it seemed impossible to believe it would ever grow into an adult wolf. "You're not giving me much of a choice, he murmured with a tired smile. As much as he wanted to detach himself from the problem, something inside him told him that abandoning the pup would be wrong. It was as if, by caring for the little one, he was healing something broken within himself. The next morning, he decided to act. He grabbed the small first aid kit from his backpack, even though he knew it wasn't ideal for wounds like this. He improvised. Carefully, he cleaned the wound with water and antiseptic while the pup woke up, letting out soft whines of pain. Lucas immediately stopped, his heart aching. "Easy, it's going to be okay. I promise." He knew the pup didn't understand his words, but the gentle tone seemed to have a calming effect. So, Lucas kept talking, as if he were speaking to someone. "I know it hurts. But you'll be fine, okay? Trust me." With every sentence, the pup trembled less. It was as if, in some way, it was starting to understand that Lucas was trying to help. After cleaning the wound, Lucas made a makeshift bandage from strips of fabric. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could do. When he finished, he offered the pup a piece of dried meat from his backpack. The pup hesitated, its eyes wary, but in the end, the smell won out. It stretched its neck slowly and took the food from Lucas's hand. In that moment, Lucas saw something in the pup's eyes: strength. Even injured, it still had the will to fight. He knew there was work ahead, but it didn't matter. He wasn't going to abandon the pup. They were in this together, and for the first time in a long while, Lucas felt like he might be on the right path. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you love animals and their heartwarming stories. In the days that followed, Lucas and the little wolf began to build something special. The pup, which he named Coda, gradually stopped being afraid and started to trust him. At first, Coda only stayed close when Lucas was quiet or sitting near the fire, but little by little, the pup began to follow him around the camp. Wherever Lucas went, Coda hobbled after him, his leg still wrapped in the makeshift bandage. It was as if the little wolf instinctively knew this human was his safety net. "You're getting too attached, you know?" Lucas murmured while feeding Coda small pieces of dried meat. But even he couldn't deny feeling the same. For the first time in a long while, Lucas wasn't thinking about the friend who betrayed him or the pain he carried. He was completely focused on taking care of Coda. It was almost as if the little wolf was healing something inside him, too. During the day, Lucas kept himself busy reinforcing the camp and checking the surrounding area to make sure there were no other dangers nearby. Meanwhile, Coda watched him, sometimes trying to play with a stick or sniffing around the ground. It was such a simple behavior, but Lucas smiled every time he saw the pup acting like a normal wolf cub. Still, Lucas knew he couldn't keep Coda forever. The pup was a wild animal and belonged in the forest, not in a makeshift camp. "Your family will find you soon," he said, trying to convince himself. Deep down, though, he had already grown too attached. Then, one afternoon, as they walked through the forest, Lucas heard something that made him stop immediately: howls. These weren't distant howls like the ones he had heard before, they were close, very close. Coda perked up his ears and looked in the direction of the sound. Lucas knew what this meant: Coda's family was nearby. He froze, his heart racing. A mix of relief and fear washed over him. Relief because Coda could finally return to where he belonged. Fear because Lucas didn't know how the pack would react to the presence of a human. "Well, let's find out," he said quietly, more to himself than to Coda. The howls grew louder, and before long, Lucas saw the first wolves emerging from between the trees. They moved cautiously, sniffing the air and scanning their surroundings. The leader of the pack was a massive wolf with scars on his muzzle, a clear sign of his experience. Lucas held his breath. He knew any wrong move could be seen as a threat. The leader advanced slowly, stopping just a few meters away from Lucas and Coda. The pup took a few limping steps forward and let out a weak howl. That was enough to catch the pack's attention. The wolves studied Coda for a few seconds before the leader turned his gaze directly to Lucas. There was no aggression in the wolf's eyes, just an intense curiosity. Lucas felt as though he was being assessed. He raised his hand slowly, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "He's all yours, buddy. I just took care of him until now," he murmured. To his surprise, the leader stepped a bit closer, sniffed the air around Lucas, and then turned his attention back to Coda. With an almost imperceptible motion, the wolf signaled to the pup, who hobbled, more like stumbled, toward his family. Lucas felt a lump in his throat as he watched Coda be welcomed back by the pack. He was happy for the little wolf but couldn't deny the emptiness he felt. As much as he knew this moment would come, he wasn't ready to say goodbye. Before disappearing into the forest, the pack leader turned back to Lucas one last time. It was a deep, almost grateful look. Lucas stood there, trying to grasp how such a simple moment could mean so much. When the pack finally vanished among the trees, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Looking up at the sky, Lucas let out a sad smile. "Go on, Coda. You're home now." After days of trying to resume his routine in the forest, Lucas began noticing strange signs along the way. Boot prints on the ground, broken branches in unnatural positions, and even spent bullet casings scattered in a few spots. He stopped in front of one of the casings and felt his chest tighten. Hunters! There was no doubt about it. Lucas knew exactly what this meant. Someone was hunting in the forest, and not legally. He had read about hunters killing wolves to sell their pelts or simply for sport. He tried to push the thought aside, but it came back like a punch to the gut. Coda's pack was in danger. He walked a little further and found something that sent a chill down his spine, a net partially hidden among the leaves. This wasn't just a sign, it was a certainty. The hunters were armed, organized, and ready to capture any animal that crossed their path. Lucas looked around, trying to process what to do. His mind told him, "This isn't your problem. Just leave and pretend you didn't see it." But his heart screamed something else. He knew what the hunters would do if they found Coda's pack. He imagined the little wolf, the one he had cared for so diligently, being dragged away by those nets or wounded by bullets. No, he couldn't let that happen. Even though he wasn't an expert in dealing with hunters, Lucas decided he would do whatever he could. He looked up at the sky, took a deep breath, and said to himself, "I'm not abandoning them." Lucas was finishing setting up an improvised and harmless trap to delay the hunters and protect the wolves when he heard a familiar sound. He turned quickly, his heart pounding. Through the trees, Coda appeared, limping but with a determined glint in his eyes. The little wolf looked directly at Lucas and, without hesitation, started following him. "Coda, what are you doing here?" Lucas murmured, surprised. The pup seemed more confident, as if he had decided he wouldn't stay away from the one who saved him. Lucas sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You just don't give up, do you?" he said with a tired smile. The pup stayed by his side, alert, as if he understood that something serious was happening. As Lucas continued his efforts to throw the hunters off track, something even more unexpected happened. Right behind Coda, other wolves began to appear. First 2, then 5, until Lucas spotted the large leader of the pack among the trees. The massive wolf with scars moved silently, merely observing. Lucas froze, feeling the weight of its presence. He knew this wasn't normal. Wolves rarely trusted humans. Yet here they were, following Coda, as if the pup was the link connecting them to Lucas. The leader took a step forward, approaching Lucas slowly. For a moment, their eyes met. Lucas couldn't explain it, but he felt a silent understanding between them. "I'm trying to help you," he said, even knowing the wolf wouldn't understand his words. The leader remained still but showed no signs of aggression. Lucas took a deep breath and started walking again, now with Coda by his side and the pack following quietly behind. With every step, Lucas felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier. He knew the hunters were close, and now it wasn't just him at risk. The pack was trusting him, and he couldn't let them down. Using his knowledge of the forest, he began setting up more complex traps. In one strategic spot, he arranged branches and rocks to create a natural barrier. Elsewhere, he erased tracks that might lead the hunters in the wrong direction. As Lucas worked, Coda stayed close, watching every move. The pup even tried to help, dragging branches with his teeth or sniffing areas where Lucas planned to act. "You're really in this, huh?" Lucas said with a smile. He glanced back and saw the rest of the pack standing still, watching. It was as if they were waiting for Lucas's lead, even though he hadn't directly commanded them. The unlikely partnership between Lucas, Coda, and the pack began to take shape. Lucas used his understanding of the forest, while the wolves relied on their natural instincts to confuse the hunters. They marked territory in strategic locations, left false trails, and even stationed themselves in lookout positions, ready to alert if anyone approached. Lucas never imagined he'd be leading an operation with a pack of wolves, but there he was, feeling a connection with them like he'd never felt with anyone before. He knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. Coda and his family were with him, and together they would fight to protect the forest. The tension in the forest was palpable. Lucas and the pack moved silently, trying to keep the hunters confused and away from the wolves' territory. But time seemed to be against them. With every step, Lucas knew the hunters were getting closer. He glanced at Coda, who was sticking close to him, then at the pack leader, who watched with sharp, attentive eyes. They needed something more to turn the tide. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, Coda stopped. He lifted his head, ears perked up, and let out a howl. But this wasn't just any howl, it was strong, determined, and seemed to carry a call within it. Lucas froze, staring at the pup, amazed by the strength in that small wolf. The sound echoed through the forest, almost magical in its reach. It was as if that howl had awakened something much greater. The response was swift. From every direction, other howls began to join Coda's. The entire pack started howling, creating a wild symphony that seemed to make the forest itself come alive. Lucas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, a connection to this raw, untamed force that he had never experienced before. But the hunters heard it too. Lucas spotted one of them further ahead, stopping and looking around, clearly unsettled. They knew the wolves were nearby, but the sound now seemed larger than life, more than they could handle. It was as if the wolves weren't just animals but a living force of the forest, responding to the threat. Coda kept howling, unwavering. The little wolf, whom Lucas had found trapped and defenseless, now seemed to be the center of this moment. Lucas watched with a mix of pride and awe. He had never imagined Coda would lead so powerfully. The pack responded to his howl as if he were an essential piece of their group. The sound of the howls grew so intense that the hunters began retreating. Lucas saw one of them raise his weapon, but the pack leader stepped forward, baring his teeth in a clear warning that no threat would be tolerated. The hunters exchanged nervous glances and, little by little, began to back away. Lucas let out a sigh of relief, feeling the weight of the tension lift from his shoulders. He looked at Coda, who was now staring at him with bright, determined eyes. "You really know what you're doing, huh, little guy?" he said with a smile. The young wolf seemed to have grown before his eyes, not just physically, but in strength and courage. The howls gradually faded, and the forest returned to silence. But Lucas knew something had changed. That moment wasn't just a victory over the hunters. It was proof that Coda and his pack possessed an unbreakable strength. And, in some way, he was now part of that strength too. Lucas understood that while the howls had scared the hunters, they wouldn't give up so easily. They were organized and would undoubtedly return with more resources. He needed something definitive to resolve the situation. That's when he remembered the emergency GPS he had in his backpack. He carried it for extreme situations but never imagined he'd use it to protect a wolf pack. Wasting no time, Lucas activated the device, sending a signal to the local authorities. He knew it would take a few hours for help to arrive, so he decided to keep the hunters distracted until then. With the help of the wolves, he continued crafting improvised traps and natural blockades, making the hunter's path increasingly confusing. The pack, led by the large scarred wolf, worked in perfect harmony with him, as if they were one unit. Coda, meanwhile, stayed close to Lucas. The little wolf seemed to understand that he was at the center of this effort, and the trust he displayed was almost moving. Lucas looked at the pup and felt a mix of pride and gratitude. He had never imagined that the helpless creature he had once found would become such an important part of the pack's fight for survival. After a few tense hours, Lucas finally heard the sound of vehicles approaching. He climbed to a higher vantage point and saw the authorities arriving. It was a relief to know they were there, but he also knew the hunters might try to flee before being caught. He quickly descended and found the pack leader. "It's time, my friend. Let's end this." The wolves, as if they understood, positioned themselves strategically around the area. When the hunters noticed the arrival of the authorities, they tried to run, but Lucas's traps and the pack's coordination kept them cornered. Some tried to argue, but the evidence was everywhere: weapons, nets, and even the pelts of animals they had already captured. There was no escape. As the hunters were taken away, Lucas looked at the pack. They were retreating, heading back to the safety of the forest. But before leaving, the large leader turned to Lucas once more. The wolf stood still, staring at him with an intensity that felt almost human. Lucas felt this moment as a sort of farewell, a silent acknowledgement of what they had faced together. Coda, however, hesitated. The pup looked at Lucas and then at the pack, clearly torn. Lucas knelt down and stroked his head. "Go on, little guy. They are your family." Coda seemed to understand. He stepped back, gave Lucas one last look, and then ran to catch up with the group. When the forest was silent again, Lucas sat on the edge of a fallen log, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. He had saved the pack, but in some way, they had saved him too. For the first time since his friend's betrayal, Lucas felt his trust in the world returning. He realized that doing good, even when no one is watching, is what truly gives life meaning. With that experience, Lucas made a decision. He couldn't let what had happened fade away. It was time to do something bigger. Inspired by the wolves' courage and Coda's strength, he began planning a conservation project to protect wolf habitats and educate people about their importance in nature. He wanted to ensure that no other animal would have to face what Coda had endured. That night, as he packed his things to leave the forest, Lucas looked up at the starry sky and felt a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew his life had changed forever. And deep in his heart, he knew that Coda and the pack would always be a part of him. Months passed since that intense adventure in the forest. Lucas had returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. Inspired by the wolves' loyalty and courage, he began working on a conservation project aimed at protecting their habitat and raising awareness about the importance of these animals. It was his way of giving back for what the pack, and especially Coda, had done for him. The work wasn't easy. He faced bureaucratic hurdles, indifference from some people, and the challenge of securing resources. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered Coda. He remembered those bright eyes and the little wolf limping beside him, never hesitating. That was enough to keep him going. One day, while visiting the reserve he had helped establish, Lucas decided to take a walk through the forest. He wanted to see how the environment was recovering and check if his efforts were making a difference. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the sounds of nature filled the air. Everything seemed in perfect harmony, yet Lucas couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. He knew he was doing the right thing, but he couldn't help but miss the connection he had built with Coda and the pack. And then he heard it. A howl. But it wasn't just any howl. Lucas would recognize that sound anywhere. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to find its source. He followed the sound to the edge of the forest, and there he was. Coda. No longer the helpless pup Lucas had found months ago, but a strong, confident young wolf. His fur gleamed in the sunlight, and his posture showed that he was now part of something much bigger. Coda looked at Lucas with the same bright eyes, as if saying, "I never forgot you." Lucas stopped, a smile spreading across his face. He crouched and opened his arms, even though he knew Coda was no longer a pup to come running to him. But, to his surprise, the young wolf took a few steps forward, paused for a moment, and then let out a small howl, as if in gratitude. "You're doing great, little guy," Lucas said, his voice full of emotion. He knew that moment was a gift, a sign that, even after everything, the bond between them was still there. Before disappearing into the forest, Coda looked back at Lucas one last time. And in that gaze, Lucas felt something words couldn't describe. It was a goodbye, but also a confirmation that their connection would never be broken. Lucas stood there, alone, but with his heart full. He knew his journey of healing was complete. And he also knew that Coda would always be a part of him, just as he would always be a part of Coda's story. With one last glance at the forest, Lucas took a deep breath and returned to his work, determined to protect the world that now meant so much to him. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your opinion about this story in the comments.